Hello again, writers. This is a video slide presentation on the counterclaim section of your final paper. By this point, you should have read the very few pages in practical argument that are specifically about how to refute opposing arguments. So if you have not yet read that from your textbook, please pause this video, read it, and then come back here because this just sort of walks you through what the textbook outlines as to how to go about that. So you may be wondering at this point, where do I do this in my paper? If you've taken a look at the outline for this paper that you are filling in as an assignment, you will see the counterclaim section is located in that outline right before the conclusion or right before the solution. That is often sort of the natural place for a counterclaim to go. As you've been progressing through your paper, you've been supporting and defending your own ideas. And then before you conclude, you want to acknowledge that there may be some people who disagree with this, and here's what they're going to say about it. Or here's some evidence I found that seems to contradict this. Let me explain why that's not actually a contradiction. So often right before the conclusion is the best place to put it. However, it may not be the best place for your paper. So keep in mind that that outline should be modified to suit what works for your paper and your audience. A lot of times it makes a lot more sense to have counterclaims throughout your paper. So maybe you have a paragraph where you have a particularly controversial idea supported, or you have some evidence that's a little bit shaky, and you want to acknowledge that before you move on. And if so, you sometimes want a counterclaim paragraph in the middle of your essay after that paragraph, or even within that paragraph for a few sentences, you want to acknowledge some opposing viewpoints. So you may have multiple small sections where you do counterclaim work, or you may have one paragraph in the middle of your paper, or you may have one paragraph in the end of your paper where you do this counterclaim type of work. Regardless of where it shows up, you're going to follow the same structure to make sure you do it well. And the key here is that first word on the title, respectfully representing and responding to counterclaims. A lot of times I think when we're taught argument essays, we see the counterclaim as a chance to sort of beat down the opponents who have opposing views, but that's not really an effective way to communicate, especially today, especially if you have a controversial topic that tends to have, political disagreeers on both sides. So we really want to use the counterclaim as a place to build a relationship with our audience and with the people who may disagree with us so that we can move forward together to work towards solutions. So I really want you to conceive of the counterclaim in that way, and this process can help you make sure that you're doing that in your paper. So there are really three steps to representing and responding to the counterclaim. The first step is to make sure that you have represented that viewpoint accurately and fairly. And so you're going to summarize what other people say, people who disagree with you, without adding your own bias in, because you really want to show your audience that you are listening to people who may disagree, that you hear what they have to say. So here are some ideas of how you can do that. A good transition, like critics of this idea might suggest. Opponents of this idea express concern about. People on the other side argue. People on the other side claim, right? And sometimes you can name those specific people. Liberals might claim this, or, Nancy Pelosi said this, right? So you can give specific sources as well in this section. So step one is really to, first of all, anticipate what your audience might disagree with. What are the weak spots in your argument that someone who's reading your paper might pick out and say, oh, nuh-uh, I disagree with that. That's not right. That's not true. So if your audience is going to disagree, which parts of your argument will they disagree with? And that's really where you need to build in counterclaims. You also want, especially in a research paper, to use reasonable sources of people who are disagreeing with you and defending their own opposing viewpoints. You don't want to pick the people who sound the craziest because then it'll be like you didn't really listen to what people said. You just pick someone who is easy to call crazy, right? So you really want to pick a reasonable voice for the other side, and that will help show your readers that you understand and respect all sides of the issue. This is why in your preliminary research assignment for this paper, I asked you to go to allsides.com and specifically to search for sources that disagreed with you, because you want to pull those sources into your paper in this first section. This section can sometimes be quite long. It can be a paragraph or a page long, depending on how many sources you can find that disagree with you. And again, it can be sort of scattered throughout your paper. The next step, and this is a critical, essential step if you're going to actually effectively communicate to people who disagree with you, you have to make concessions. And that means acknowledge what they are right about. Acknowledge what is good about what people who disagree with you are saying. So for example, if we're having a gun control debate and both sides tend to be really heated and very passionate about their beliefs, you want to say, I see that you are interested in protecting your family, and I appreciate that, and I am too. Or you want to say, I know that you are worried about children in schools, and so am I, and I also want to solve that problem. Or I recognize the evidence that you have pulled in that says how many children are, killed in school shootings. Or I recognize the evidence that you have, or this story you told about someone who broke into a home and but was able to defend themselves, right? So you want to try to find common ground. Here are some ways that you can do that. This point of view makes sense because, or this position reflects a justified concern about the safety of our children, whatever it is. Or it's an important point. We really do want to acknowledge this evidence that exists or this perspective that exists. You can use phrases like admittedly, certainly, of course, it's true that. And these are all really handshake moments, and you want that handshake to exist where you say, I disagree with you, but you have a really good point about this, or I think you're right about this, or I know your heart's in the right place about this. And to do that sincerely, not just to check the box and say I did it, but to really attempt to express that handshake moment in your paper. And then, of course, you don't just want to leave it there, because then it'll sound like you're giving up on your position. And in an argument paper, you always want to come back to that thesis. So step 3 is then to return to your own argument, transition back into a defense of your viewpoint. So they said this, that's really important. Nevertheless, they said this, that's really important. On the other hand, yet, despite this evidence that they're pulling in, this is still more important, or we still think this, and here's some more evidence to support that. So you want to return then to a defense of your own position, explain why, despite the good points that they have, your position is still valid, despite the opposing evidence, or despite the numbers that the other side is going to bring in, your point is still valid. And it really takes some thinking about, like, what are the underlying priorities each side has, and maybe you want to say those values are important, but these are more important, and here's why. So it can get kind of philosophical in this one, or you may be pulling in sort of data and evidence to support you. So I have added with this presentation sort of a handout with some example paragraphs where the writer moves through all of these steps of the counterclaim. So I want you to notice how they move through step 1, 2, and 3 in those. And here is a 2-paragraph counterclaim section, actually, so you don't want to necessarily try to squeeze this all into one paragraph. In the first paragraph here, I'll give you some time to read this, so you'll want to hit pause and make sure you've read through this. So this is this came from a paper where the student was arguing that you should be allowed to commit suicide if you have a terminal illness and are miserable, basically. And so here they begin. Critics argue that the reason why. So this is them representing the other side. And look, they've pulled in a really good source. So they haven't pulled in some crazy person. It's a doctor, an associate professor of a medical center. So they pulled in a reasonable source from the other side. And they don't just move away from it quickly. They explain it in other words, for example, right? And then they pull in that source again. They sum up that source's argument in a really respectful way. So you'll notice none of the language in this is like, these crazy people say this, or, these these heartless people argue this. It's quite neutral in its tone because it's a respectful acknowledgement that reasonable people disagree, and here is what they say. So, and it takes them a whole paragraph to do this, and you should take your time on it to make sure you get it right. If someone disagrees with you and they're reading your paper and you don't even represent what they say correctly, they're not going to listen to you. In the next paragraph, they transition then into the handshake moment. It may be true, right? So this may be true in some cases. They're making a concession. They're acknowledging that the other side has a good point. In fact, I would like to see this in this example expanded for a few more sentences where they take a little more time for that handshake moment before moving on. In the rest of the paragraph then, they have this transition, however, and then they defend their own perspective again. So in the rest of this paragraph, they pull in more sources and they defend their own perspective again. And then the final sentence of this counterclaim section is sort of that defense of their own idea against opposing viewpoints. One thing I do want to point out about this is this example is not an MLA, so these are the dates that this was published. Remember, in MLA, you have the page number instead of the date, so I just wanted to point that out for you. I also want to point out one more thing that's working really well in this paragraph, in these paragraphs, which is a sense of flow, and the use of transitions helps create that sense of flow. So I want you to just skim through the paragraphs one more time and notice the transition words that you're seeing. And I actually have underlined them here for you in this rust color. So the beginning of the paragraph, critics argue that signals to your reader, this is not what I believe. This is now my counterclaim section, right? So you want that really clear signal to the reader. It doesn't have to be critics argue that. You can use some of those other transition words that I provided to you in these slides. And then we've got these transitions as well that help the reader understand. You're breaking it down for them. You're explaining it to them. And the therefore signifies, okay, I'm wrapping up what they say overall. So really nice transitions almost at the beginning of every sentence to really create that sense of flow and logical connectedness to the paragraph. Then our handshake moment begins with a really nice transition. It may be true, right? So that's signaling to your reader, I am respectfully acknowledging that viewpoint has some good things about it. And then our transition that signals to your reader, now I am going to come back to my own perspective, sort of argue against it in a really gentle and respectful way. Even these are not patients creates a sense of flow because it refers to the patients they've just talked about, these patients. And so, transitions can be using key words again to help create that sense of continuity in the paragraph. And then in short is a great way to transition to your wrap-up sentence. And so again, we have a really nice sense of conclusion to this paragraph. And notice again, this counterclaim section is 2 whole paragraphs. And I think that's reasonable in a long paper. The counterclaim may be a whole page, one of your pages. Or of course, you can do it in a smaller way several times throughout your paper. Hope that's helpful to you as you're building the counterclaim section of your paper and actually writing it out. Please email me if you have questions. And if you're not sure you've handled this section well, you're always welcome to email me, attach your paper and say, my counterclaim's located on page 3. Can you take a look at it and give me any feedback? I'm not sure I've been respectful with the other side. Questions like that are really easy for me to help you because I know exactly what you're looking for with feedback from me. Okay, be working on your papers, folks, and let me know how I can help. Bye.